Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, in his The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper gave his rather well-known statement about tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. This is the so-called paradox of tolerance, as presented by Karl Popper. A tolerant society can't be tolerant against the intolerant, lest it will lose its tolerance. This statement has been used as an argument by various people to justify laws against certain types of speech, to justify cancel culture, to justify the banning of people from various services by companies, to justify various types of practical consequences for various types of utterances, and even to justify violence against those perceived as intolerant and against tolerance. Usually, though, looked over is that Karl Popper's views were actually a bit more complex than just this statement. And I will here mention the rest of Popper's argument here that I think is relevant, in order to not misrepresent him. So here comes some further quotes from Karl Popper that gives context to the tolerance paradox. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies, as long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion. Suppression would certainly be unwise, as stated by Karl Popper. And he also stated furthermore, but we should claim the right to suppress them, if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. So Karl Popper actually did specify that it is only when force is used by actual physical force should intolerance come into play, according to Popper. This is the entire thing with fists and pistols, meaning, as I interpret it, physical violence. And I interpret intolerant in Popper's argument as those who use or advocate using violence to suppress others. Yet a lot of people either ignore this part of Popper or have other interpretations or derivations of Popper's ideas about tolerance. Some, for example, argue that due to the fact that certain arguments can't be met or countered by rational argument by their nature in a debate, thus justifies intolerance by default. I would say that this lies outside of Karl Popper's argumentation, as he probably envisioned that every argument that is intolerant can be argued against can be argued through rational argument. But there are certain people that would disagree with this. And some also argue that speech is violence itself and should thus be suppressed, even by force and violence, as certain acts of speech harms others, either directly through insulting and hurting the feelings of people, or indirectly by causing harm through later action, and thus means that this is a sort of intolerance and thus should be suppressed. They have the view that a society should be tolerant by default, yet it should not tolerate intolerance itself. I'm going to argue against both this view of Popper's argument that I think is his real views, as he had argued in his The Open Society and Its Enemies, and what I think is an interpretation of his views that I think isn't in line with what he actually argued. I will argue against both here, though mainly the later, as I agree with Karl Popper's views mostly. Popper's view that you should only be intolerant towards intolerance that leads to violence. Violence here being used to suppress speech and arguments. And the secondary views that say that tolerance is the goal of society and that we cannot tolerate any intolerance except the intolerance of the intolerant. That we should be intolerant of in a much more broader way than just intolerance connected to violence and silencing of opposition. And here comes my counter-arguments. First is that Politics is about intolerance. What actions should or should not be allowed? Which actions should we tolerate? But also, above even politics being about intolerance, the function of the state is violence. By imposing various laws that are the definition of intolerance towards certain behaviors, and these are enforced by violent acts, by imprisonment, even execution, or other methods, whatever you might see as a legitimate use of force, a legitimate use of violence by the state apparatus, both domestically but also in foreign politics, as questions about diplomacy, military, defense, or military intervention are questions about violence. In fact, I would even go so far to claim that if a society feels that a certain state of being or certain actions are not good for it, then they will be intolerant, regardless of the actual merits against those actions or that state of being. Because they will not tolerate it. They will still be intolerant. And they will also call for or even implement violence when they call for changes in the law or for changes of the state of being that exists in the society or in foreign relations, which is supported by the monopoly of violence by the state, even if it is done through democratic means. Any call for any political action will thus more or less involve violence and intolerance in some degree. And there are a lot of actions that aren't intolerant in themselves, but are still highly destructive for society, that people would probably want to be intolerant towards. And this popular intolerance might manifest in legitimate laws against speech and arguments, such as speech containing fraud and incitement to crimes that are undesirable, and thus in a way are meeting speech and arguments intolerantly with fists and pistols. Yet this is part of legitimate democratic politics. With this considered, Karl Popper's arguments, and the arguments of those that I would say misconstrue his arguments, risk authoritarian rule, which Popper decidedly has argued against in his The Open Society and Its Enemies. Both these versions of the tolerance paradox risk authoritarian rule because both of them undermine the legitimacy of legitimate democratic intolerance that is necessary for a democracy to function and implement the people's will. And though to different degrees, both versions can be used to silence legitimate democratic speech with the justification that it is intolerance against intolerance. You can make laws against certain types of speech, you can do cancel culture or similar, which risks to silence open, legitimate discussion about what not to tolerate, which is vital for a democracy. And as Karl Popper admitted, ultimate tolerance is kind of a paradox, and paradoxes are, according to the standards of logic, invalid arguments or statements. So this is a counter using the standards of logic against striving for maximal tolerance in a society. The goal for a political process cannot and ought not be tolerance itself only, and the focus of repression in a democratic, free society, according to my view, should not be the intolerance, but the actions and speech for direct actions that crosses the line from thought and speech into direct actions against and contrary to current law. The moment the actions, not the words, not the writings, not the ideology itself, directly subverts currently active law as decided through democratic process by the people, is the moment you can step in against other people as they do actions. The democratic ideal ought to be, in a free society, as Karl Popper strives towards a free society, a context of open debate and the use of free speech, voting, and a system of laws that allow even odious, hateful and intolerant beliefs to be explored and held and spoken without the fear of persecution, except if those beliefs are enacted against current law instead of arguing for the changes of the law or changes of political policy. Speech that talks about changing the system to whatever needs to be allowed in a democracy and should be seen as separate from all other actions in a democracy, as you must allow critique of the system. You must allow other views of the system to be allowed to be spoken. Though you cannot allow direct calls to break the current system outside of the democratic process, because that's a different category of action. That is incitement, tolerance or intolerance. But if the speech or actions directly, not indirectly through arguing about changes of the law for the future, incite to break the current democratically decided law or creates direct harm, such as for example fraud or screaming in someone's ears so that their eardrums burst, that you need not allow, as that is a direct action rather than indirect speech for changes, as that undermines the will of the people in a democracy. Democracy is, after all, about the will of the people, of the majority, to, in freedom of speech and thought, have the ability to debate, discuss, and then decide what politics should be implemented. And politics, as I've argued before, is about what should be tolerated or not. So decisions that can be considered intolerant must be allowed, as long as it goes through the democratic process. And there is also a practical argument here. Those that use Popper's argument to shut down others often show a lack of trust or belief in the people's ability to decide what is right, often pointing towards the intolerance of a certain German group without considering the total catastrophe of the Weimar Republic and what had happened around there, and the chaos that was ever present and fueled the extremism of this group. It is not a very representative case of normal human behavior, would be my argument. In most cases, the majority of people are rational actors and will vote rationally under normal conditions where they do not live in a state of constant panic and fear and uncertainty. I'm also of the opinion that democracy requires us to believe in the majority, in the people's ability to actually be able to make more correct decisions, generally, than singular individuals or a small group of individuals can do. As this belief underpins the entirety of democratic thinking. But, yes, I will admit it, people have made mistakes throughout history regarding following intolerant beliefs that turned out less than good. But that also does not mean that silencing people or being intolerant towards what is seen as dangerous ideas, as intolerant ideas, the ideas that one does not like, has not also brought practical issues. In fact, I would argue that it's the same logic as used by many of the intolerant systems that have failed throughout history, that have caused enormous suffering, have been almost always argued through repressing bad things, through removing bad views or those that espouse bad ideas. And arguing against intolerance is kind of the same type of argument. And countless examples exist throughout history of the most repressive regimes that were created for what was seen as a good cause, that suppressed other ideas for being bad, evil, revolutionary, reactionary, or whatever type of evil. They did it in the name of good against evil, against what was unwanted. Exactly as Popper and those that came after him and reinterpreted his ideals argue against intolerance as being something bad. Remember, intolerance is wanting to suppress something, and thus intolerance is included in any sort of ideology or idea, including your very own views of the world. You can't have a political view without being intolerant towards something, because you have an ideal about what is good and what is not good and should not be allowed in society. And who controls the power to decide what is correct intolerance or not will, in cases with limited free speech, decide who gets to have a voice, who gets to decide the politics of that society. Intolerance, as in the use of physical force or threat thereof against those who are deemed intolerant and limiting their freedom, is dangerous and arguably unjust, as it impedes upon the democratic rights of the people to decide what should be allowed or not to be allowed, for the people to be intolerant towards what they deem to be bad for society. And, as has been argued by John Rawls, a just society must tolerate the intolerant, for otherwise the society would then itself be intolerant and thus unjust. And with this quote by the moral philosopher John Rawls, I end this video. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.